This is the last chapter of civics, and we're going to get started with section 1. And this is all about voting, is mainly the point of this chapter. Voting is an important responsibility of United States citizens. FDR said, "Let us never forget that government is ourselves. The ultimate rulers of our democracy are the voters of this country." During the early years of the nation, most voters were white, male, and landowners. It was established this way that you had to be a landowner in order to vote. They wouldn't allow people who didn't own land to vote. The mentality behind it was the people who owned the land should be determining what happens in the land. Now, of course, we know that at the time this was not allowing women who wasn't able to own land. It wasn't allowing African Americans who were slaves at the time. So it was very, very restrictive of who could vote early on. Today, property ownership is not a part of it. You don't have to own property. There's a lot of people who never own property their entire lives. Nothing wrong with that. It's just, people who live in big cities, things like that, that there's really no benefit of owning the land if you live in New York City unless you just want to. You must be 18 to vote, and no state can prohibit people from voting based on race, gender, or age as long as you're at least 18. And there's constitutional amendments that have allowed those rights to vote. For one, the 14th Amendment gives everybody the right of citizenship if you're born or naturalized in the United States. Second, the 15th Amendment gives African American men the right to vote. The 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. And then the constitutional amendment that allows the lower the voting age from 21 to 18. Those are what gives the right to vote. Most states require people to register to vote that way. And sometimes they make you register as a Democrat or a Republican when it comes to voting in primaries and stuff like that. But, that was weird. You got to chill. But most states require people to register to vote. In order to vote, you need to register first. And you do that through the state. Most states require you to register at least 25 days before the election. There are a number of ways, and that's just so they can process everything, make sure they have it ready for election day. There are a number of ways to register depending on what state you live in. Who do you register to vote for the first time? You must show proof of citizenship, address, and age. When you go to register, you got to prove that you're a citizen. You got to prove that you live here and what your age is so that you're 18. On election day, voters go to the polling places in their precinct. Now, a polling place is the location where voting is carried out, and the precinct is a voting district. For example, with me, I vote in Phil Campbell. The Phil Campbell Community Center is where I vote at. People who live different places vote different places. If you live in East Franklin, there's a place out there to vote. If you live in Frog Pond, there's a place out there to vote. They set up voting districts all over the place, different places to vote all over the place. And that is a polling place. It's where you go to physically vote. Polling places usually open about 7 in the morning, usually close about 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. They usually open about 12 hours. They have volunteers that work there. They basically, and I'll get into that in a few minutes, a ballot is the list of candidates on which you cast your vote. And I'll show you a picture of examples of that in just a few minutes. But that's the list of candidates, and you mark that, and that's how you vote. Once you go inside, you go to the clerk's table and sign in. There's a ballot. When you sign in, you show proof of ID to the person at the table. Usually a number of people work separate stations at the polling place, and once you do is you get your ballot from the person and go vote. So, I've read all that. Now let me tell you what it's like to actually go and vote. Typically what happens, and depending on where you live, some places have a long line to go and vote. Some places you walk right in and vote. Usually at Phil Campbell, I think the longest line I've ever had to stand in was about 15 people. But for the most part, usually it's you go in, you do your process, and you leave. You go in, you give you have to show your ID. What they do now, they've computerized a lot of the stuff at the Phil Campbell polling place. You take your driver's license and you put it on this little tray thing that has a scanner that reads it, and it identifies who you are. From that point, they give you your ID back. You go to the next person. You have to sign in a booklet. If you're voting in a general election, which is the election where you vote for president or whatever, you just sign a regular book. If you're voting in a primary, you have to sign in the Republican or the Democrat book of which group you voting in. They give you a ballot and a pen. You go into this area. There's tables you can sit at. There's also these things that has these dividers up that separates it where you can kind of go and stand and you cast your vote and no one can see how you're voting. When you get done with that, and I'm telling you just how it is at Phil Campbell up here. When you get done with that, you take it to a machine. You feed it like a feeder machine. You put the ballot in there, it feeds it in there, and it counts it. And then it also stores the physical copy of your vote. So that's typically how it works at the polls. This is a ballot right here. So you see, this is when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was running. So this is 2026. Basically, for the general election, you would just fill in the circle of whoever it was that you're voting for. There's also a write-in section where you can write somebody in and fill this in for president, vice president. Chances are for president, a write-in campaign is not going to usually work. It's never worked. It probably never will work because you got to have a lot of support. But there is the possibility of a write-in vote working. You see here is Donald Trump for the Republican Party, Hillary Clinton for the Democrat Party. You have Jill Stein, which ran on the Green Party, Gary Johnson, which was independent, Richard Duncan, which was a non-party candidate. And so it just kind of shows you right here what a ballot looks like. This is another example of what a ballot would look like. So you just fill in there. It says Republican, Democrat. Here's a write-in section for Commissioner of Agriculture. You've also got these District Court of Appeals over here where you're voting if these people should be retained in office or not, basically. People are there at the polling place to make sure that people with a disability can vote. If you have a physical disability or something that can keep you from getting there, there's people there to help you with that. It's also confidential, so people are not able to see how you vote. The only way people know is if you tell them. There are multiple types of voting machines. In Phil Campbell, it is a feeding machine. That's not this one right here, though it's very similar to one at Phil Campbell. You just feed it in it and does all that. This is an electronic voting right here on the left. And there, it's just a touch screen. You just check that. Now, people are a lot of times are afraid those are more prone to read it wrong or to change votes and all that. I don't know. That's just kind of the problem when you get into technology is you start worrying about that kind of stuff. And I just noticed this is a Dominion voting machine, which is the issue that they had in Georgia this last election with people saying that the machines were rigged, or they were Dominion machines. So, even on the feeder machines, you can still things can be off. Absentee ballots is a ballot that can be sent in if you're not able to vote on election day. Voters must request an absentee ballot. The absentee ballots are voted on the day of the election or the next few days. This past election, there was a situation where people were getting unsolicited ballots, where people were getting mailed ballots that they didn't ask for, or multiple ballots they didn't ask for. So again, there's some issues there that may need to be solved, but for the most part, it's just kind of part of it. My first election I voted in was the election that George W. Bush won in 2004, and I filed an absentee ballot because I was at the University of Alabama at the time. I wasn't going to be in Arley to cast a vote. Excuse me. So that's absentee ballots. Returns are the results of the election. So the returns are in. It's the results. The polling place workers count the votes, take the ballots, and return the returns to the election board. The board takes and counts the votes on the returns for the entire city or county. The board sends the returns to the state canvassing authority, who certifies the election results. And in a major election, the news media tries to call the race as soon as possible. Even as early as 7 o'clock when the polls close, they're like, Fox News or CNN is predicting that so-and-so has won this state. And if you watch election coverage, you'll see some of that. And they base a lot on the exit polls, the results of sample polling of exiting voters as they're leaving. They're saying, how did you vote today? And you don't have to tell them but they asked that to try to get an idea of what kind of people are voting and what direction states are leaning. Major television news channels will devote the entire night to election coverage. They usually do a good job predicting the election results. They want to make sure they get it right because, like in the 2000 election with George W. Bush and Al Gore, they predicted Al Gore as the winner, and turns out he did not win. And so after that, they've tried to be a little bit more precise. Some people criticize this. They may feel like that out west people have less voter turnout because if it seems like that someone's already winning the election, people in California, if they haven't voted already, maybe like, I'm not going to go vote because they already know how it's going to turn out. The best way to prepare is to be informed from non-biased sources, separate fact from opinion, and ask yourself about the candidates that you're choosing between who you want to support. These are just a few questions that's important to ask yourself. Does the candidate stand for the things that I think are important? Is the candidate reliable and honest? Does the candidate have relevant past experience? Will the candidate be effective in office? And does the candidate have a real chance of winning? Those are all really important questions. You need to ask that. Are these things that the candidates can do? The electorate is people who vote for the president. Not all citizens vote because of apathy or lack of interest. And so a lot of people don't vote because they really don't care. And there's a high percentage of the population who doesn't vote every election. Citizens who vote usually have an interest in politics and the future of the country. They usually have an interest in the direction the country's heading. Voting is important because it allows us to elect our leaders. We have to safeguard that right to vote so we don't lose it, and allow citizens to express their views. And that brings us to the end of section 1. We'll continue with